Hello, I'd just like to say a few words about Liszt's Étude d'exécution transcendante, his Transcendental Etudes, because these are pieces which virtually all pianists must, at some point in their lives, study, if not all, at least some of, because they're very often asked for in competitions and all sorts of other things, or as exam pieces, and actually are often used in recital as well, though the book played as a whole isn't that often encountered, but it works. As I suppose many people know, Liszt first thought of these studies when he was 14 years old, and they were published as, they were going to be published as Étude en 48 exercices, but he didn't write 48 of them, he just wrote the 12. And there is a sketch for the beginning of something that might be the 13th one, but that's as far as you can get with it. So they move through a cycle of keys, starting in C-major and going to a-minor, then to F-major, then to d-minor, and so on. You know, the circle of fifths backwards, if you like. So we finish in B-flat minor, and all of the keys are flat keys, there are no sharp keys in these etudes. That's not troubling, there's plenty of opportunity for modulation, and in any case, they cover a scope of technical requirement that is pretty comprehensive. Liszt expanded these little pieces that he wrote when he was 14 in 1837 into 12 grandes études, which created a bit of a sensation at the time and was very well reviewed by Schumann, for example. But Schumann, like everybody else at the time, lamented that Liszt was the only person who'd ever be able to play them. And although that's not entirely true now, because a few people have given these 1837 versions in concert and on record, but on the whole, they are things that we can look at, but very often not play, because there are musical superiorities in the final version of 1851, which make the last readings of the texts, in most cases, more desirable, I believe. Almost never is anyone allowed or asked to play the first one by itself. He himself called it Preludio. The titles, by the way, only crop up in the final version of these pieces, and even there are two studies that don't have titles. It's simply a flourish. And it's just a matter of 2 pages and covers the entire keyboard up to and including the top A. In fact, he's going to go even higher before these studies finish. So it's clear that in 1837 he was writing for an instrument which most people didn't possess, because he included notes that they just didn't have on their keyboards. By the time he writes the last version, we're all well aware of what's going on. So that's merely a sort of preliminary good evening, friends, and then we get down to the serious business. And the next etude, which doesn't have a title, but and is marked a capriccio, but it's actually really quite taxing piece. I suppose it's of small comfort to know that it was in its middle incarnation very, very difficult. What now goes was in the right hand playing second finger than an octave, which is of course much harder. But what he ends up with is actually very crisp and clean, and a very good study in rhythm. Job is not to play it too fast and not to get too carried away at the end. This piece very often becomes a complete shower of notes and not all of them accurate once you get to the prestissimo towards the end. But there is a way of pulling it back so that you can end in tempo primo, and then that gives you a little room to maneuver when you get to the cadence at the end. So very often people manage to make these bars stretch because of the difficult leaps, and especially because it's really in a fast 3, which you have to practice better than I did. But at the end, it's good to think of places where you can let some light in amongst, without heavy pedaling, because that's followed immediately by. And then right at the end, Liszt doesn't give you any pedal marks at all, but my suggestion is that you hang on tight to the ones that have got sforzando and arpeggio signs on them. And then play staccato all the way to the end of that block. And finish with his pedal mark as directed. By the way, I should immediately suggest that if you're looking for the best available edition of this piece, as we speak, it is from Universal Wiener Urtext edition, and it's edited by Christian Huber, who's done a fantastic job. So it's very nice to be able to point out that this is a very good, clean edition with no extra things that you don't require, no editorial interventions of an unseemly nature, and absolutely clean as a whistle and correct. So it's a pleasure to be able to recommend it. The third etude is marked poco adagio, which means don't play it too broadly. And it's very funny to think that what is now started life in 4/4, but it did, and he then rethought it into 6/8, and putting stresses in different places comes up with a very delicate piece. Now, on the face of it, this one doesn't actually look like a study, but you'd be wrong to think that because it's absolutely a study in tone production, in pedaling, and also involves real tests of legato playing in thirds and all manner of things which are worth proper study and do not come free of charge. You have to prepare them with some care and attention. And the use of the pedal, if you can't take a tenth in this piece, it's quite difficult, because he was writing them everywhere. If you have to stretch any of these and break them, which most people will have to do that one, an A flat to a D, the secret, I believe, is to play the bass note all the time on the beat, and then play the tenor voice after the beat just a little late. If you try and go with the tenor voice on the beat, you either have to put a hole or run the risk of this one mixing the harmonies together. But this applies not just in this piece, it applies in many a piece where a little bit of careful use of deciding where you're going to break a chord or where an arpeggio that's already written might be best started. I think it's nearly always going to be useful to put the bottom note on the beat. So we have at the climax of this one, these chords are big for many people, and it might be better not to keep on playing the chords harped, harp the first one and then risk leaving notes out of the others. In other words, only hit the bass note once. It's not an ideal solution, but it's better, I think, than constant arpeggiation. The fourth study is kind of a playground for pianistic delinquents very often. And nobody should play this piece if they just want to show off. Actually, nobody should play anything by Liszt if they just want to show off. But Mazeppa is a big test of piano playing, and every time the theme comes back, it's slightly faster than it was before, and the complications of the inner voices ebb and flow depending on what comes to you most easily technically. Everybody knows perfectly well that the introduction was a later edition, but not a later edition in the Transcendental Etudes, but to the Grand Etude of 1837, which bore no title. He then added a short introduction and put the title Mazeppa on it and put a different coda on it, and then he expanded even that with a thing he marks cadenza ad libitum, but I've never heard anyone leave it out. I don't think you can. The tricky bit of the cadenza, which is this, is working out when and where and how to change the pedal. And there are several ways of doing it, but what you can't do is just leave the pedal jammed down for the entire 3 lines of it. But if you play that one works, which is pedal on when they're on the way up and don't pedal on the way down, but you could do it exactly the opposite. What you can't do is pedal on every note. But the top one you can pedal very safely almost to the end of it, but the last notes you've got to get the pedal off so we can hear the cadence into D minor. Now, the next passage, Liszt writes fingering on it. He writes fingering every time there's a change of harmony, and it's very clear what he wants you to do, which is to play the outer tune with the inner voices played alternative hands, bop, 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 bop. So that's just using the second finger and the fourth finger of each hand. So and this actually produces a much better sound than some people who recommend doing almost legato 2-4-1-3, which is, of course, if he hadn't instructed you with this fingering, might be the first solution you would think of, but it doesn't make the right sound. So you have to persevere, practice slowly, and make sure that you can do that. And once you've studied it properly, actually, it turns out to be much more comfortable than you thought it would. The middle section of this piece presents a B-flat major transformation of the theme with pattern in the right hand and the left hand. And the thing here is to get the pedaling right. So that the harmonies don't ever get mixed up. And you have to get very clever and do a little pedal flutter once you get to this version. And Liszt loved chords, did that sort of thing, and we will encounter them right at the end of this book in the last one of these studies. The coda of this piece was not part of the first conception because he hadn't coupled it with the story of Mazeppa yet. But as we know from Victor Hugo's poem, which Liszt quotes at the end, that this man has been tied to his horse and he falls off and is as if dead, and then recovers and of course eventually becomes king. The passage is merely marked più moderato. It is not lento molto, it is not. It just be calm. Otherwise it dies when you get to this passage. That tempo is going to serve you well if you hang on to it to play. And so on. He only writes vivace on from there. So you can speed it up on the way down. It doesn't matter so long as your final chords are as noble as you know how to make them. And though he specifies nothing in the way of the pedals, I think it's best to play the last clear octave empty in a pedal of its own. The fifth etude in this set is technically very tricky, and you just have to practice it very slowly in order to and you can practice and just taking each voice, one staccato, one legato. And the thing that you need to do from the very beginning is to take note of the tempo direction, which is allegretto. Now the pity of this piece is that it starts with an introduction, still allegretto, which is much easier to play than, and so it is very often taken at breakneck speed, and then when you get to the theme, the performers cannot continue with the tempo that they've just discovered. So you have to find a tempo that works for the whole piece and stick with it. And then you can play with a certain amount of capriccio, but don't make so much a habit of it as that you can't actually hear that really the harmonies are. really actually quite like Mendelssohn. And it's on the face of it a very difficult piece, but actually to listen to it, it's very uncomplicated. In the middle, there's one of these places where Liszt wrote two texts, and I think is the one you've got to go for, not the single note version. This is another place where you mustn't get too fast, because you will be embarrassed very shortly afterwards if you do. There's a bar where Liszt writes what sounds like 16 notes that are the same. He notates the first group of 4 as E sharps and F sharps, and the second group of 4 as F naturals and G flats with a diminuendo, and repeats the 8 in the same way. And the only thing I can recommend that might help make any differentiation is to play the first 4 without pedal, like that, just to make it seem like the world of the sharps and the flats are coming together. And it's actually the sharps that win out at this moment, because the recapitulation of this piece, instead of being in E flat, in B flat, comes in A major, and then he has to work his way very quietly back to the right key to finish. It's interesting that the only major difference between this one and its earlier version has got to do with this passage, because on his piano of 1837 he cheerfully wrote with all the notes repeated every single time. And on a heavier action piano, I don't think you can make that sound like Will o' the Wisps or anything similar. At the very end of this study, there's a possible ambiguity, because it's written, but I'm pretty firmly convinced that the left hand should actually be included in the ottava sign, that it has been up till then. Because that balances the chord better. I will not make that a sort of major lawsuit, but I just think that you might be wise to think about raising that chord under the octave sign. The next study, Vision, is probably a little less taxing than some. Interestingly, the beginning, which we now play with 2 hands, he wrote originally for you to play Anyway, we must decide how we're going to arrange that passage for ourselves. You've got a job to make sure that you bring out all of the colours and all of the accents where there are accents, and then don't put any where there aren't. For example, even if you use 2 hands to play it to make it easier here, and the second time that happens, it's and you must make the differences clear. When you have clearly the interesting line is the line that moves in the middle, so you have to pick it out. and later on, when both hands join in, you can do towards the end of this piece, Liszt writes some alternatives for you to play with your left hand, and I think they're all very good and should be considered. For example, instead of playing he suggests curiously, there's one spot here where he doesn't make it simpler in comparison with the 1837 version. One of the things you can see with Liszt very often when he rewrites pieces after he stopped playing in public, so he's now in Weimar and he's in his late 30s, but I think he clearly thought of himself as being middle-aged, well, from the moment he stopped playing in public. And you will find that all earlier pieces that have things like or even in them, he now writes up arpeggio signs on them, and this piece is no exception, where but the next line he's left an 11th in, if you can't take it, you must play the bottom note on the beat and together with the right hand, and then get in the top note as soon after as you can, so you don't smudge anything. Then he wrote a coda with still more arpeggios in, and then he had the great idea and puts it on an extra stave of imitating three flutes instead. And that one is a very firm recommendation as a superior text to the so-called main text. There's no point in playing fast here. The tremolos have all got to be absolutely measured. He writes numbers on them, so that here, for example, they're all in triplets. And so on the last line, where in the second last bar he just writes this with 36 above it. 36 is exactly the number of notes you must play. So from here, and don't try and do anything theatrical or histrionic. It's a straightforward, noble piece. The next one of these etudes is the only one in the set that does not derive from the collection that he wrote when he was 14, and has a tune which he probably thought up in around 1837. What it does have, however, is an introductory flourish, which is this, which he lifted from an early piece which he otherwise discarded entirely, called Impromptu on Themes by Rossini and Spontini. This introduction, of course, has nothing to do with either Rossini or Spontini, but it was a passage that Liszt knew was not without interest, and so he saved it. But then he put the study that follows it in a completely new key. Now this where you actually start the tempo di marcia, before you actually get to the march itself, which is... Anyway, this march has got to be straightforward and in tempo. The temptation to use the middle pedal is colossal, but I think you should avoid it because this was written at a time when he hadn't even considered that there might be such a thing. He would, of course, be recommending that piano manufacturers did invent this thing, which they did, but they took a very long time about it. And the first piano that Liszt took delivery of that had such a pedal was not until 1883. And the notorious pieces in which he wants long sustained notes over underchanging harmonies, which he remarks about himself in his later life, that he'd been a pioneer with the Constellation number 3, where he did want you to repeat that D flat, not just tie it through. And also in his transcription of the Valse des Sylphes from the Damnation of Faust with its pedal D. But most importantly in the Grosses concert solo, which one of the reasons I expect why nobody played it was because there was no proper solution for this passage until the middle pedal came along. And Liszt himself could only solve it by rearranging the piece for two pianos and dividing the text up at this. He wrote in 1849. But these studies have their real birth back in the 1830s, so he can't have been thinking of it. So much as it would be nice to put some of it in, we shouldn't. Don't play too fast, because if you play too fast, then when you get to the passage which is entirely in octaves, it's going to be very troublesome to pedal neatly. His pedal directions are very clear there, because this get it off for the end of that, and very often this piece is played as if the pedal didn't change at all. The next piece presents a number of problems, most of which is that he starts by writing presto furioso, which is an indication for people to start at a tempo that they cannot possibly continue even as soon as bar 7. So it's a good thing if anybody has a quick look at the version of 1837 to see what he actually requires you to do to be furioso. And playing it slowly so you can hear. Which is now, but can't be played much faster than that, but it's now much clearer. But if we think of it as being in 6, not in 2, so if you think of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you know, that's fast. And then when you get to... You've got to hold the tiger, and it will help if you play Liszt's exact articulation here and find some fingering that suits it. Playing it slowly, that's under a slur, that's separated. So if you finger in the right hand, say 1, 2, 3, 4, and then put 3, and the left hand 4, 3, 2, 1, and then put 3, and if you learn this kind of articulation from the very beginning, it actually keeps the tempo much, much tighter. And most people get the tempo during these passages completely discombobulated, so nobody can actually remember what time signature they could possibly have been in. And this applies to the whole of the first section, even to the last note of the scale is separate from the rest and has got a sharp accent on it. And many performances do not bother with this, but I think it's absolutely worth the pursuit. It also stops you from getting too fast and having then to come back to a completely different tempo for essentially the second subject. There are plenty of notes in this study, and playing it too fast is never going to help. When we get to the third theme, you've got to do several things at once. The left hand has got and the right hand has got a tune which goes with some accompaniment underneath and an inner voice that goes like that. And what happens normally in performance is that you hear people play, which is not the tune at all. In other words, the notes that he's put the accents on have got to be the melody. And he keeps going on like that for quite a long time, and it's only when you get to the most frenetic bit of this passage, but by then he changes the tune completely. And allows those descending notes to become more clear, and then of course you can draw the parallel with which is coming up to join matters together. The very tricky climax of this piece you can also keep under control if you don't go too fast. When you change to 2/4 as he does in this passage, keep it still with the principal pulse the same. Because what is about to happen is one of those nightmare passages which is so easy to get wrong. And they keep repeating these. Going up to the top B. This passage is, to all intents and purposes, identical, even in the 1837 version, so it's interesting that he thought some pianos would have this high B on them. Most of them didn't. In fact, when Liszt started out, and there are other passages in these studies that show it, he knew that a lot of people's pianos finished on the F below that, which is quite a distance of an augmented fourth. The very powerful conclusion requires some very careful pedaling. Liszt writes 3 Fs, which he doesn't write very often in his life, and big pedals for And then he writes these chords. The interesting one is that one. So and its importance becomes apparent only when you get to the very end, so that if you study this piece, it's that chord before you start this. And you might think about putting the pedal in these staccato chords just a touch on the chord that's the diminished seventh. That's it. The next one is Ricordanza, which is very popular and very beautiful. The genesis of this theme, it's marvelous to think that he actually wrote when he was just a kid, because it turns out to be one of his nicest written melodies. I'm looking for there's a place where I believe there's a wrong note. It's not a wrong note in the edition, I think it's a wrong note in his composition, which is in the introduction. That's what's printed, but in the face of the surrounding musical territory, I'm convinced that he's left out a natural sign on that D, and it should go. Because the very next D is marked with a flat sign, and it's very seriously untidy as a piece of musical grammar to go D sharp, D flat. And so for those reasons, I think that's, because there's no point in the piece where otherwise he writes those that melodic shape in any point of recapitulation of the theme. That's a small thing. The actual theme, you just have to work out. Liszt writes pedals that go all the way to the ends of bars, but I think in a few cases it's probably wise to clear the pedal a little sooner. It's just the tops of these scales, which his pedal doesn't really clear as well as it might. Then there's the famous problem coming up where one bar is shorter by a quaver than the others, and you just have to live with it. There are some efforts made in various editions to extend it, to mess around with it, to change the rhythm. Just play it freely from the moment when you get to. Print it right. Some years after these pieces were published, Liszt wrote a very short extension to the coda, which is actually extremely fine and lovely, and is printed in the Wiener Urtext edition, and it's very well worth considering. I'm not insisting on it, but you can see why it's a very nice thing. Etude number 10 is without a title, but the tempo direction tells you all you need to know, which is Allegro agitato molto. Now, when he first thought of this piece, he wrote, which is very nice, but this, with one hand over the top of the other, is more interesting. And then instead of doing, you will notice, although many people don't, that this, the first time is marked piano and nothing happens. And the second time it's got, which I'm exaggerating now, but it's got a crescendo and diminuendo. And I don't think there's anything remotely accidental about that at all. And so I would make sure that you pointed out the difference in the performance. Liszt wrote a lot of fingerings in this one to teach you how to, without getting into trouble, and I firmly recommend all of them. If you can't take these tenths, as before, put the bass note on the beat, so you can pedal cleanly, and everybody knows what the harmonies actually were. This is a splendid piece. It's very succinct. It is of course in sonata form, and the second subject is one of those great inspirations, which is this. Which then becomes itself a codetta theme later on. This is very often played in the wrong rhythm in performance. Many of you will have heard with double dotting, but it's and it's much better left just like that. There are places where people speed up, slow down, mess around, and there's a cadenza-like passage. If you're going to make it come out tempestuoso, then don't start at forte and don't start at allegro molto. Then it will work. You get to the recapitulation, which is a very fine piece of writing. The interesting feature of this piece is just one bar. When you get to this marvelous progression is now so familiar to us from this piece that it may come as a surprise to some to know that it actually is one of those theoretical things that he toyed with over many years of trying to suspend tonality. Of course, you will notice that the top is a chromatic scale, and you may also have noticed that the bottom of the progression is a whole tone scale. He seems to have written this down as an album leaf for the first time in about 1840. And at least one of the manuscripts of this album leaf, which they vary in length, these progressions, and sometimes they have a cadence at the end that takes you to one key or another, because it will be apparent to you that you can go from there to or almost anywhere from this, which is why he called it Prelude omnitonique. Anyway, he hadn't found the proper place to put this, because he knew it belonged in a composition, until he wrote the revised version of this etude, because if you look in the 1837 version, of course, this bar is not present. So finally he gives this little prelude calling card, call it what you will, its proper home, and then connect immediately. And it's just very appropriate to, it just gives you enough space to breathe in once before you start on the stretta. And I suppose the best thing to say about the stretta is, stretta means getting faster. It doesn't mean immediately play prestissimo, because if you do that, then when you get to, it will not work. And then most people speed up a long way. And you can let go that pedal if you want to, and have the joy of finishing on a 6/3 chord, which is, after all, what he wrote. Harmonie du Soir is, without question, I think, the most beautiful piece in the book. And it's one of the nicest pieces to play. It sits magnificently under the hands. It's full of chords that may be tricky. Some of them he writes arpeggio signs on them, and we should take him at his word. Sometimes he writes the arpeggio out slowly, then just as a wiggly line, then slowly again. So just do what he says. The theme make sure that that happens, so that they're in the pedal and they come out clean. And don't be in a hurry. In bar 11, I suppose it is, you have a collision between the little finger of your right hand and the little finger of your left hand, and we have to have a solution for it. One hand has got crossed over, the other one has got and this has also got an arpeggio sign on it. And what you can do is play the left hand chord all together like that, and only play one note in the right hand, but play the left hand chord after the right hand and put the right hand in the pedal. So these also with the bottom note, these big arpeggios with the bottom note on the beat, so that you can make those pedals nice. Then this one, and this right, sorry, a whole pedal, a whole bar of pedal there. These ones, you can put, yes, a slur to that one, but take the pedal off. And that way you'll also get rhythmic interest. And also outline some very good harmonies. Every time you have this, with the spread in the right hand, do it, whereas the one famous one where he goes, make sure that you make it clearly different. So here you can help your pedal if you play the right hand as close to legato as you can do it. But that's enough tempo so that when you've got... It doesn't have to get too much faster. The middle section has been printed by different editions changing Liszt's rhythm, and I think it's entirely unforgivable to do so. And I think that what this edition prints, and what indeed the first edition prints, is exactly right. So the way to think about it is to study it firstly without the arpeggiation signs, so that you've got then put them in, but put them in so that do not come out as one arpeggio. So keep the rhythm. Then this one goes the whole way then. Anyone who's having trouble with this one, you've got enough time to play the top note with your right hand. Here, play the F sharp with your right hand, thumb, then move your right hand thumb to play the 3-note chord. Then you won't get into trouble. So, when it says molto animato, remember that you have a long way to travel. So, and note well that those notes are all marked staccatissimo, so don't leave the pedal down for them. When you get to the big climactic version of this tune, Liszt uses his favorite spread hat accent to cover more than one note. It has the same effect as the sharp accent like that, but it's spread across two, so pulling it apart and distorting it just to make it clear. It just applies for those 3 bars so that we don't come out with a tune that we think is, which isn't much of a tune, but and this, then the tune obviously transfers to, with the pedal you can hold it on, but I would get it thinned out and then off for the last 4 chords. Otherwise, just enjoy playing it, because it's one of these things that is just so good to sit down with. The coda, there's no direction at all to slow down, and he slows down the rhythm. So to slow it down even further than the rhythm, I think is entirely unhelpful. So if we go from where he says calmato, in this bar, by the way, pedal on the notes where there are ties with your right hand thumb. The edition prints a little album leaf at the beginning, which Liszt wrote for the poetess Tony Rubb, which presents a completely new introduction to this work. I've never actually heard it played in concert with this alternative. The one that we all know and love goes. And for Tony Rubb, he wrote one that starts actually in C-sharp minor. Some of the notes sound the same, but then they go somewhere different. Which is a very different effect altogether, but then that's Liszt in 1876. So it's very nice to know about, and certainly you should play it through because it's beautiful. But probably stick to the principal published text for competition purposes and for most public performances, I would recommend. The last one in the book is quite deliberately not an absolutely abominable piece to show off with, but it nonetheless has a very good air of finality to it once the storm subsides. The beginning is one of those pieces that's very awkward, and it's very often recommended, as indeed in this edition, to play the top notes with the left hand. Anyway, to make these effects right, you can of course play all with your right hand, but you could also take the bottom note there with your left hand and play then. The hardest things to do are of course to make sure you don't misstrike any of the melody notes and that you keep the pedals clean and separate. It's marked andante con moto, and that's the tempo that you should play it at. It doesn't need to get frenetic at all. There's some places where it will build up, where he writes energico, which is starting at bar 25 with which is an interesting kind of rhythmic canon because it puts you actually ill at ease to think that you're starting a theme, perhaps not on the right beat of the bar, but it comes out right in the end, and it allows him to build up to a splendid climax When we get to the stormy section with the chromatic scales in the left hand, Liszt is entirely unhelpful with pedal marks. There aren't any. So you've got to work out what to do for and it'll usually work if you pedal once on the way up and then flutter your pedal and then release it at the end of the scale coming back. Like that. Because this is going to become very serious when we have and note very carefully the last 4 notes have got staccato dots on them, so clean the pedal up there. Sorry. And then be as quiet as you possibly can so that this comes out making sense. If you look very carefully, you will see that the note values halve suddenly in order for this fairly free, those ones, essentially are seven notes to the beat. And he then crams more into each thing so that the last beat has 10 notes in it in that scale. But don't get too fast. Don't, even when he says strepitoso, hang on to the tempo. Because these tremolos are all marked and numbered for you to play exactly 24 notes. The coda of this piece is one of the great gems, and we need not to speed up, but then not also to slow down to nothing, and to keep the wind doing the best we can with the thirds. So if you take it from I don't believe that those last bars are meant to be pianissimo at all. There is a long diminuendo preceding it, of course, but once you've got to the end of that diminuendo, then there's with the hairpins on, then a crescendo all the way up here. Sforzando because it's on an odd beat of the bar, which is to say the 6th of 6. And if you've got yourself to forte, then hang on to that chord loud enough, long enough for the sound to become much less. And then you can end elegantly. And it's very significant that he does not end these 12 etudes with a bang, just with firmness and a sense of completion. Thank you.